Hey, good morning, church. How are you out there? Hey, my name is Jeremy. I'm one of the pastors here on staff. Welcome to Redemption Gilbert. We're so glad you're here with us on this lovely Super Bowl Sunday. I am a Cardinals fan, so I have no dog in this fight, but I'm going to pretend and root for Brock Purdy, Arizona's own. Hey, and if that doesn't work for you, that's fine. You can root for Taylor Swift. So everybody's got it covered. It's great. It's great. It's going to be a good day, lots of food. Hope you have fun hanging out with your family. Just one announcement before we get into it today. In the last couple weeks, we hosted an informational meeting for our Alaska trip that's coming up this summer. Just to remind you, we end up going out to Tenalian Bible Camp in southwestern Alaska every summer to help run that camp for a week. And we have another one of those trips coming up this summer. And we're doing another informational meeting today, right after this service at noon in room 100. So if you weren't able to make the other meeting and you'd still like to have a conversation or hear what it's all about, make your way over to room 100. You don't need to RSVP or anything. Just show up and you can hear what we're doing there. Just a reminder that you showing up does not mean that you are committing to go to Alaska or we're committing to take you to Alaska. It's all information. But it would be helpful for you to hear what we're doing there and to see if it would be something you could participate in. So make your way over to room 100 at noon after church here today. We're going to be continuing in our sermon series in the book of Esther. We started it last week. We got through a bunch of kind of intro and table setting and historical context that gets us to this story, and we worked our way through chapter 1, and we're going to work our way through chapter 2 today. But before we do, I want to talk to you about the Vietnam War. In the late 60s and early 70s, we were embroiled in a war in Vietnam, and it was really what is known as a proxy war. Although we were fighting there in that place in Vietnam, it was really the United States versus the Russians in that moment, trying to hold the line on the pressing of communism into Southeast Asia during that moment. And one of the things that happened, there was a lot of complexity that went into that conflict, but one of the things that the American military experienced was that Russian radar technology and surface-to-air missiles had gotten much better since the last time we fought, and we lost a lot of aircraft to radar detection and surface-to-air radar-guided missiles. And so following Vietnam, as you can imagine, that battle in American history holds a unique significance because of how complicated it was and the fact that we ended up pulling out without really winning. And so it caused a bunch of introspection in the military. How do we do this better in the future? What does it look like to be better prepared? And they partnered up with one of their longtime military partners, Lockheed Martin, to begin development on some new technology, particularly in their Skunk Works department, which is just a really cool title that I like to say. This is their super secret development technology group in Lockheed Martin, and they began working on a new vehicle that would allow them to have the upper hand as we went into war in the future. And as a kid who grew up in the 80s, this was the coolest thing that ever hit the skies. It was the F-117 Nighthawk, the stealth fighter. I guarantee I could find you a 6th grade notebook that had sketches of that airplane on it that I drew because it was so cool. It started development in the late 70s. It was rumored to have been finished in the very early 80s and rumored to exist because it was still top secret until 1988 when I was 10 years old. And then it was unveiled to the world as being this amazing piece of secret technology that we had that would allow us to go after our enemies in a way that made us completely invisible. Nobody knew that we were there. Now, part of it meant that we had to develop this piece of technology in a way that you normally wouldn't. Normally, you were trying to build the fastest, the biggest, the most maneuverable, the best weaponry that you could have, but that's not actually what they did with the F-117 Nighthawk. Instead, it was slower, and it was less maneuverable, and it had less offensive capabilities than most of the craft that we had developed after that point because it was trying to do something different. What it was trying to do was be low profile and undetectable from radar. In particular, in 1991, during the Gulf War, it was used to great effect to fly silently through the battlefield, and no one even knew it was there until you saw the effects of what it was doing, dropping bombs on targets. It was described by military brass at the time as being stealthy and mysterious. Why am I talking about the nighthawk? Because the book of Esther presents us with a story and kings and activity that's going on, but the real story is the story underneath the story, the stealth bomber named God, who's working his way through, stealthy and mysterious and causing actions to happen that we can only see as we look backwards. Just a reminder as to what happened in chapter 1. I selected a few of the verses out of chapter 1 to give us a highlighted overview of that chapter. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, who was the king of Persia. For 180 days, he displayed his vast wealth of the kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. And then at the end of that 180 days, he has a week-long party with all the most important officials. And it says, on the seventh day, when King Xerxes was high in spirits from wine, he commanded Queen Vashti, his queen, to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come. And the king became furious and burned with anger. And then we quote King Xerxes talking to his advisors, and he says, Queen Vashti's done wrong. The queen's conduct will be known to all women, and so they will despise their husbands. And they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she wouldn't come. And his advisors say, therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree that will go through all the land and can't be repealed, that Vashti will never again be in the presence of King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position of queen to somebody else who's better than her. And the king and his nobles high-fived and thought that was a great idea. The end of chapter 1. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the book of Esther is it tells this as one story, but it comes with a prequel chapter, which is chapter 1, because we have a time jump that jumps from chapter 1 to chapter 2. Just as a reminder about who all these folks are, to quote William Shakespeare, one of his most famous quotes is this: all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and entrances. The book of Esther is a unique one in our Bible. It's the only one of its kind. There's a few things that make it unique. You will hear people, anytime they begin to talk about Esther, they'll say, it's the only book in the Bible where God is never mentioned. And that's absolutely true. But it holds some other uniquenesses in that it was produced during a 200-year window of time where in pop culture of its day, it was very popular to tell what they call court tales. Stories that happened in the court of the king. They're dramatic. The Persians did it. The Babylonians did it before them, the Greeks did it, and the Romans did it. These were popular kinds of stories. And the other thing that was coming to popularity during this time is what they called novels. The first stories that were told in kind of a modern sense, where it is a novel telling you a story, but also trying to get you to take away things from that story that aren't implicit to the text. Things that the text is trying to teach you that aren't actually in the story that you have to infer. It's one of the only, it is the only book of its type in our Bible. And so we need to figure out, what is it actually trying to get us to understand? And this idea that Shakespeare gives us, that everyone, whether king or put upon young woman, are just players in a great play. And the question that it asks us to wrestle with is, who is the director? Is it the king? Or is it someone else? One of the commentaries I'm using on Esther says this: God is always at work, even in disaster. God is already unfolding the next steps. When Vashti refused to play along in the king's little drama, God was preparing an entirely new cast of characters to take center stage. It's very tempting to, in chapter 1, say, well, what was going on with Queen Vashti? Why would she refuse his direction? Was there some greater point that she was trying to make? Was she standing for the rights of women? Did she hate Xerxes? Was there a historical family issue? We don't know. Here's what we do know. God moved Vashti's heart in this moment to make room for Esther, who shows up on the scene today. That's what we do know. King Xerxes, just as a reminder, was the son of Darius, the previous king, the second major king of the king of Persia. And he took over this large multi-ethnic empire. Most scholars would say the Persian Empire was the very first superpower on the planet. And when he took over, two things happened. Number one, the vassal kingdoms of Babylon and Egypt decided in this handover of power from one king to the next, you know what, now's our chance. If we don't want to be subject to this guy and his rule anymore, he won't even notice. He's going to be so busy trying to figure out how to be king, we will just stop paying homage to him. We will stop giving him tribute, paying him money, taxes. And Xerxes says, no, actually, this is my opportunity to demonstrate who I really am. He marches his army down to Babylon and burns the city to the ground, famously takes one of the statue of their god Marduk back to his home in Susa, and then marches down to Egypt and destroys the rebellion there home before coming back. Now the text here says, and he renewed his father's campaign to subjugate Greece and punish Athens. Chapter 1 happens in the and. He had went to stop these rebellions, then he came back home. He throws these massive parties in order to gain sympathy and get support from the military commanders he would need to do the second part. I want to go to Greece, and I want to follow up on what my daddy failed at. We talked about the Gulf War, ironically, just a few minutes ago. George H.W. Bush was the one who oversaw that war, and at the end of that war, Saddam Hussein was still in power until his son, George W. Bush, was the president, and he went back to Iraq and finished the job. That's kind of what's happening here. In fact, we have an etching that we have found in history that is a quote directly from Xerxes, just as a reminder before I get to that quote, but here's the map of the area that we're talking about. You have Egypt down here in the bottom left, and here's Israel and Jerusalem kind of here in the center. And Susa, which is the capital city that this is set in, is right here in the middle of the empire. And Greece is up here where they're trying to attack into. Here's what the quote we have says. This is from Xerxes himself. It says, I, therefore, on his behalf, my dad's behalf, and for the benefit of all my subjects, will not rest until I have taken Athens and burned it to the ground in revenge for the injury which the Athenians, without provocation, once did to me and my father. His dad was humiliated as the guy who was expanding the empire to its greatest strength. His one defeat was at the hands of the Greeks. And when Xerxes comes to power, he says, I'm going to right that wrong. We're going to war and we're going after the Greeks. Now, there's one problem. He gets his butt handed to him by the Greeks again. The Greeks miraculously hold off what was claimed by him to be a multi-million man army. Most scholars say it was probably 500,000 soldiers. And 10,000 ships were going to sail to Greece to defeat them. And the Greeks held off the army long enough to get them to kill a bunch of their guys, weaken their forces, and destroy almost half of their navy, which ends up with Xerxes going back home. One of the articles I read on this section said this: with the crushing defeat, Xerxes had little choice but to consider withdrawal. He ran back home. After all, this is what he told himself, above all, the king of Persia belonged in the capital of Susa, where he could continue to rule. That is where chapter 2 picks us up. He has marshaled his forces, he's went to war, he's gotten humiliated once again, and with his tail between his legs, he goes back home. We're going to head into chapter 2 in Esther here in a second, but would you join me in praying that God would meet us as we head into this text? Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this time to be together as your people, to study your word, to head into a mysterious and unusual book like Esther. God, we want to understand what you'd have to teach us out of this text. We pray that your Spirit would meet us here this morning and illuminate for us what's going on behind the scenes and how it should encourage your people even today, all these years later. God, we love you. We pray this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen. Can you hear me? Good. You good? All right, there we go. Here we go. So Xerxes comes back home. He's been humiliated. He's been embarrassed. He left 300,000 of his troops with a general back in Greece who eventually all get wiped out. And Xerxes is back home. This is what I like to think about, that we're in a part of Xerxes' life that is really difficult. Here's what the text says. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti, his queen, and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. So I want you to put yourself in Xerxes on his golden throne. What is he feeling? He's feeling embarrassment. He's feeling humiliation. Now he's back home and he's beginning to get wistful and thinking about the past and how did everything go so wrong? I had this beautiful, powerful queen and she rebelled against me. That's where everything started going off the rails. And now here I sit. And even if I wanted her back, I couldn't do anything about it. I like to think of this as Xerxes' Fat Thor era. If you've seen Infinity War, at the end of that movie, our heroes lose. It's an amazingly tragic ending to a huge Hollywood movie because they had a second part already planned. And when that movie starts, we find ourselves 5 years down the road and we're introduced to Fat Thor. Fat Thor who lost this battle and now he's depressed, he's introspective, he's sad, he's drinking himself to death. He's gained a bunch of weight. That's who I think about right now as Xerxes is sitting on his throne, wondering what in the world went wrong. What good is a king like me now? Well, his personal attendants know that this is a problem. So they come in and they say, King Xerxes, let us do something for you. Let's make a search for a beautiful young woman, young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of the realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let's do an ancient version of The Bachelor. What do you say? We'll figure this out for you. I know you're heartbroken and you're lonely. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to orchestrate a massive sex trafficking operation. Here's the deal. We're heading into Esther chapter 2. And I'm going to do the best that I can to try to avoid some of the disgusting pitfalls that are in this chapter, but we just have to be honest about it. There are things that happen in this chapter that are absolutely distasteful and hard to really understand and swallow in some ways, and yet it is the reality of what went on in these days. Here's a guy who's had his manhood insulted, he feels humiliated, and his answer with all of his guys is, what if we just send attendants all over the land and we kidnap vulnerable young women for your pleasure? Does that sound like a good idea? And he cheers up at the thought. He continues. They say, here's what we'll do. We'll place him under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch. Okay, we got to pause there for a second. Because what is the king's eunuch? It's another part of the distasteful nature of living under a kingship like the king of Persia. Yes, he was proposing for them to kidnap young, vulnerable, beautiful women from all over the nation, but also they would do the same thing to young men who would be kidnapped out of their homes, brought into the king's palace, and turned into eunuchs. Now, if you're sitting here going, I still don't know what that means, I want you, when you get a male cattle, if you're a cattle farmer, you will remove some key parts of the bull because you want them to be docile, and you want them to not be aggressive, and you want them to not be interested in the lady cows. That's what they did to young men in the kingdom. They would capture these young men, they would castrate them, and then you would be able to serve as a non-testosterone-filled man caring for the king because you were probably not going to start fights. You were probably not going to want to overthrow the king, and you certainly weren't going to mess with his harem. We got a great idea. We'll kidnap these young ladies from all over the world. We'll bring them in here and we'll put them in charge of that guy that you kidnapped and castrated. It's going to be great. He'll be in charge of the women, and then we'll give them beauty treatments, and then we will let the young women who come in, whoever you choose, whoever pleases you the most, she can become the new queen instead of Vashti. And the advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Once again, we have a king that is pushed around, manipulated, moved in different directions. He is not expressing kingship. He seems like a lout. He's a loser. But he's the king of the greatest power the world has ever seen. Now, there was in the citadel of Susa, this is in the heart, this is where the center of power, military and political power sits. The citadel of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. among those who had been taken captive with Joachim, king of Judah. They're calling back to the exile that had happened under the Babylonian Empire, and they're saying there is a guy who lives in the inner circle, a Jew who works in the inner circle of the king. His name is Mordecai. And now, for you and me, you go, okay, why is there a list of all the people that he's connected to, son of whoever person I've never heard of? Now, part of that is because we don't have context. If you were a Jew hearing this story, especially an ancient Jew during these times, these names would have not just been anonymous names for you. In fact, I'm going to point out to you the name of Benjamin and the name of Kish, and then I'm going to take you to text in 1 Samuel chapter 9. 1 Samuel chapter 9 tells the story of the prophet Samuel choosing the very first king of Israel, and here's what the text says. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing whose name was Kish. And Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome as a young man could be, found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. They discover the king, son of a man named Kish, a Benjamite. Why is it significant that Mordecai, this character, is tied to Saul? I think it's because the Jewish leader or Jewish ears who would have been hearing this would have had attitudes about someone who was living as a Jew in Persia. If you remember the story from last week, the first king of Persia, King Cyrus, allowed the Babylonian captives, the Jewish captives who have been captured, to go back home to Jerusalem, to rebuild the city walls and to rebuild the temple of God. Some 43,000 people left, but many more stayed. Why did they stay? We don't know, but we can make some assumptions. Life was probably fairly comfortable and good in Babylon. In fact, it was so good that some of them even migrated further into the nation and away from Jerusalem to a place like Susa, like Mordecai. Faithful Jews, especially the ones who had went back home, would have instantly been like, I know who this guy is. He's a traitor to our people. I don't like him. He's a dirtbag. And they said, hold on. He actually is connected directly to an Israelite king, your first king, Saul. Continues, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah. That's her Hebrew name, whom he had brought up because she had neither a father or a mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, that was her Persian name, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and her mother died. So we learned a few things right off the bat here. Number one, Mordecai seems like a pretty good guy. This girl whose parents died and he is related to, and I think she would be like a great niece to him. He actually adopts her and brings her into the family. And then there's this weird moment as it's telling us how this guy sweetly brought her into his home to care for her. Also, she's fine. It's really weird, like right in the middle. Oh, she also had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Why in the world is that inserted right in the middle of what seems like a sweet story about this young lady and her vulnerability? Because those are the very parts of her nature that made her even more vulnerable in this story. It's the one asset that she has which will still be taken from her as this story continues. It continues in verse, 8 here? When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who was in charge of the harem. Over the course of a certain amount of time, these 127 provinces that are under the kingship of Xerxes, which was described in chapter 1, they send out an edict to every one of these areas, and they kidnap young, vulnerable, beautiful women to bring into the king's harem for the efforts of picking one that the king will really like and that he will turn into the queen. Instantly, we are invited to think about Daniel. Once again, we read this and we go, great, that's part of the story. Interesting, that happens. If you were an ancient Jew reading this and you would have heard the language that was describing what happened to Esther, you would have thought about Daniel. Here's what the text in Daniel chapter 1 says. Then the king ordered his court officials to bring into the king's service young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve in the king's palace. And among those were chosen some from Judah, Daniel, and then it continues with the others that are there. Esther, who people hearing it would have been tempted to think, well, she's part of the problem. She wouldn't have found herself in this situation had she just went back to Jerusalem like a good Jewish girl. If her parents hadn't have failed in leading her in the ways of Yahweh, she wouldn't have been there. And they're instantly reminded by the language that is chosen, which mirrors Daniel. Well, that wasn't true of Daniel. Daniel was taken. Daniel was faithful. Daniel did all the things you would have wanted him to do. How dare you think that about Esther? She's an exile within exile. She is you. And she's been captured in this moment. What will she do with it? Well, Haggai, the eunuch, he thinks she's awesome. That's what it says. She pleased him and won his favor. She's pretty. She has a nice figure. And apparently, she's a very winsome young lady. She has a great personality because she wins him even though her physical prowess has little to no effect on him because of what has been done to him. He still immediately is drawn to her and finds her winsome and likes to be around her. And he provides her with special beauty treatments and special food. You have to remember, Haggai is in a tough position here. He has a job to do, which is to oversee this large group of young ladies and make sure that at least a few of them the king is happy about, because that's his job. And here he finds Esther, and she's a gem. He's excited. He gives her special access to beauty treatments, special food that she could take, probably to thicken her up a little bit so that she's healthy and ready for the king. He assigned her 7 female attendants, selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her attendants into a best place in the harem. He knows she's a first-round draft pick. I don't know who the king's going to like, but I would almost guarantee he's going to like her. Let's move her into a special place. Let's give her special attention. Let's give her everything she needs to be a success in being sex trafficked by a monster. It's really easy to get drawn into this almost romantic court intrigue and lose fact of the horror of what is happening here. It is a disgusting practice that is presented to us with little to no commentary. And it's part of what we are supposed to be wrestling with. Is this what a good king does? Is this what a powerful king uses his power for? Or is he actually using his power just to serve himself and to make himself feel better and to soothe himself? It doesn't matter who it costs. It's a question we have to wrestle with. Now, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background. Why? Because Mordecai forbade her to do so. Now, we're going to pause here for half a second because historical documents tell us that one of the things that made the Persian Empire unique in the world is that they actually, unlike previous empires, valued diversity. Almost every empire that came before said, we are going to conquer you and we are going to turn you into us. That's how we will demonstrate our power. If we make you a homogeneous version of who we are. The Babylonians captured their best and brightest, including Daniel, and brought them to the capital city to turn them into Babylonians. The Persians, unlike that though, saw that their power was demonstrated that they could rule over diverse kinds of people from various backgrounds that worshiped all different kinds of gods, that fought in their armies in unique ways, because the kings of Persia thought, what is more powerful? A guy who can rule over a group of people who look just like him, or a guy who can rule over the whole world? Now, that would tell me that part of what would be appealing to King Xerxes was the fact that they brought in unique women from all over the globe. And yet, Esther is given instructions from Mordecai, don't tell him who you really are. Don't tell him you're a Hebrew. Don't tell him you follow Yahweh. Don't make a big deal out of the way we practice our faith. Don't do it. Why? Well, here's the clue that I think it gives us, and I think it's based off what we're going to find out next week in chapter 3, is there is an undercurrent of anti-Semitism running in the Persian Empire. They tell themselves that they value diversity. They tell themselves that they love everyone equally, but here we get a clue that there is some hostility against the Jewish people, even in the heart of the diversity of the Persian Empire. And Mordecai knows it, so he says, don't tell him who you really are. Every day, Mordecai, this gives us a clue about what Mordecai's position was. Every day, he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening. Mordecai has access to the temple or to the palace. He can get close enough to the harem, which is well protected, as you could imagine, in order to have conversations every day with Esther. Find out how she's doing. What's going on? How are you feeling? Are you scared? Are you being taken care of? Are you getting enough to eat? All the things you would expect a father to tell her. And then apparently reinforcing, and don't tell him you're a Jew, no matter what you do. Now, before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete a 12-month beauty treatment prescribed for the women. 6 months of oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. I've been told, I do not have a daughter, I have 2 boys, but I've been told by my friends who do have young daughters that there is a trend going on right now on social media, Instagram, TikTok, whatever the youth are on these days, of beauty treatments, especially face cleansing, using things like toners and moisturizers. Aren't you proud of me? I tried. That's as far as I could get, but I hear it's kind of a big thing. Like, yeah, there's a whole routine, and you'll spend an hour cleaning and toning and moisturizing. I already told you, that's all I know, toning and moisturizing. I'm holding on to it real tight. You think that's excessive. How about 12 months? Now, scholars believe 2 things. Number one, that's probably exactly what would go on. If the king was going to get this special woman to come into him, they were going to give her special treatment in order to reflect how big of a deal this moment was. Also, scholars believe that this is probably poking fun at the Persians. The Persians were known for being real extra, for being super deluxe. Everything they did was so over the top, it was ridiculous. They had a 180-day party. They had a 7-day drinking party. The harems were huge. Last week, we said they were having a party on solid gold couches. That's a little extra. In fact, we have Greek records that when the Greeks kicked the Persians' butts and they captured their camps, they captured solid gold couches that they had brought with them from the capital out to the battle so they'd have a place to hang out. These guys were a little over the top. And here's an example of it. Every day, she would have 7 ladies come in and rub her skin down with myrrh in order to soften her up. I don't know, tenderize her, I don't know. And then the perfumes and cosmetics is interesting too. They would take essentially a bowl of perfumed oils and they would steam it. And then they would make you get in essentially a really thick poncho and hunker down over the top of it for a while and let it just soak into your skin. I'm just going to go with a guess here. She probably was pretty fragrant by the end of this deal. I've been around some junior high boys with Axe body spray. I can imagine what this was like. All in preparation for this moment for the king. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything that she wanted was given to her to take from the harem to the king's palace. So we're going to pause here for a second. Me and my family are big fans of the show Survivor. And there's a moment every week in Survivor where you have to go to tribal council, and you could get voted out at tribal council, and oftentimes you don't know what's coming. So what you will do is make sure to bring all your stuff with you because you didn't want to leave it back in camp. If you get voted out, you left it all behind. That's what's happening here with Esther. Here's the mechanics of how awkward and weird this whole system was. You would get captured as a young woman who's been unmarried and never been with a man, and they would bring you in, and you would stay in one group with one person, one of the eunuchs, overseeing you and caring for you in preparation. And then when it was your turn to get to go to the king, even that is a very sanitized version of what is happening here, she would be sent to the king, never to return to the harem. Instead, she would now become one of the concubines. She was used. She was no longer pure and fit for the king, and she would live out the rest of her days over here under the care of another leader, living in that environment. And so, part of what's happening here is she gets to bring anything she wants because it's what she gets to take with her, and not only is she going to be physically with the king, she's going to put on a little bit of a show for him. It's she's trying to play the flute and do a little dance. She wants to demonstrate, I could entertain you and I could be a great conversational partner. And she has to make a choice about what she's going to do in order to impress the king. And I love this because she said, in the evening she would go there, and in the morning she would return to another part of the harem under the care of Xerxes, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. So she would go from one group, and then she'd be put over here for the rest of her life. In fact, those kings were known for how big their army of concubines were. Not because they wanted to do anything with them at that point, but it just proved to everyone who showed up, as you walked by a room filled with 500 women that you're just caring for the rest of their lives, that's how powerful I am as a king. It's disgusting. It's over the top. And she was not going to get to go back to the king unless he called her by name. So when Esther's time comes, and I love this, they put it in like we've already forgot, the young woman that Mordecai adopted, you remember we've been talking about her? The daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king. She asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. This moment is significant for us because it's the very first time that we see Esther begin to show who she is as a young woman. She's clever. She's smart. She's not so dumb as to figure out, as a, let's call her 14-year-old girl, that she's going to know what the best thing to do is. Instead, she accesses Haggai, the guy who's in charge, who has his own vested interest in making sure that she's successful in this moment. What would you tell me to bring? What do you think the king likes? What would be wise of me? And she does exactly what he tells her to do. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. And she was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence on the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The first chapter tells us it was the 3rd year. Here, this is happening to Esther in her 7th year. In the 4 years in between is when he went off to war and came back and hung his head. And then she got a month-long spa pack, or a year-long spa package. Now, the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women. And she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, another party. This was Esther's banquet for all the nobles and officials in town to celebrate his marriage. And maybe even more importantly, he follows the steps of his humiliation from last week, where he sends a decree across the entire region telling him that his queen refused to obey him, and now all ladies have to obey their husbands. Now he follows that up with a new decree saying, I have a new queen, and she's great. And he sends things for people to throw parties, and maybe most importantly, he provides a holiday, which is a tax holiday. Essentially, he tells everybody, hey, this week you don't have to pay taxes to the kingdom. That's how much I love you. That's a good king. I just want to say, if anybody wants to figure out how to get us some tax holidays, sign me up. I'll take it. The king proclaims to the nation that he has brought this woman in, and now she has taken this place near him. Now, when the virgins were assembled a second time, now I love this because you go, oh, I thought we were at the end of the story. There was a process. He gave someone the rose. She accepted the crowns on her head. They had a party. And then it just continues. Well, when the virgins were assembled again, which means he's still participating in this moment. Here's what we have to remember. When Xerxes in the first chapter is having a party with all of his officials, what would have happened is you would have had a great classy dinner party. And the queens and the wives would have been there. And then when the dinner party's wrapping up, they would have excused the queen to take all the wives to another part of the palace in order to continue their classy party. And then the guys would get rowdy. They'd start drinking, and they'd bring in all the concubines. And they would have a big party there. And it was in that, as he's getting drunk, that he says to Queen Vashti, why don't you come participate in this like one of the concubines? Why don't I use you like I use them? And he continues, lest we sanitize Xerxes and say, oh, look, now he's going to become straight and narrow. Now he's got himself a good wife, and a good woman will straighten him out. Nope. When the virgins were assembled another time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality just as he told her to do and continued to follow his instructions as she had done as he was bringing her up. Here's a picture of what this looks like for any of you that are science or history nerds. This is a recreation of the citadel in Susa. This would have been his palace with the throne hall right here in the middle, and behind him the women's quarters split in half, one for the harem and one for the concubines. And out front was the king's gate, of which you can go right now. It's hard to get into Iran right now to see it, but it is there. You can go and see the gate where Mordecai would have been sitting. Mordecai, a Jew who had enough power and influence and prestige in the Persian inner circle that he was hanging around the palace all day long. During the time that Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. You might think, wow, what a significant moment this is. This stuff happened all the time. In fact, Xerxes himself is later, not too many years down the road, assassinated by one of his assistants, and we don't exactly even know why these guys are mad. It could be that they feel like he's an embarrassment. He's made the Persians look weak. He went off to war, we got our butts kicked, now he's cavorting around with all these women, kidnapping them. We need to end this guy. And Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles, and all of this is recorded in the books of the annals in the presence of the king. The Persians, probably a little known fact, were the inventors of the crucifixion. The Romans borrowed that from them. They were the first people to come up with the sadistic practice of nailing someone to a tree and letting them die of exposure, the way that Jesus was eventually killed. We don't know exactly if that's what they did here to these guys, because they were also known for another way of killing people, which was to sharpen a log and essentially put a person on it and pull them down until they essentially sank onto it. Ugh is right. These guys were gross and nasty and violent. And even the justice that is brought from this king makes you kind of turn your stomach. Makes you wonder, what does this actually look like? Here's the challenge. I was talking this morning to Brian Berger and somebody else here at the church, and we were talking about the challenge of teaching through the book of Esther. And the way it challenges me is that Esther was designed to be read as one story, and to watch the story unfold as it goes along. And because we're studying it here at church, we break it up into chapter by chapter, and we're kind of missing a little bit of the flow. But here's what I think we're supposed to be getting from it. This is from one of the commentaries I read. It's almost paradoxical how we can see God's hand once we round the corner of crisis and catastrophe. He was working the whole time. Why did Xerxes have the party? Why did Queen Vashti turn her back? Why did Esther's parents die? Why did Mordecai adopt her? How did Mordecai get his job in the Persian Empire? Why did he tell her to hide her Jewishness? What is going on? The answer is the same in every case. God is doing what God does. He's moving behind the scenes. He's orchestrating. He's using people's disobedience. He's using people's evil. He's using the things that people do that are anti-God to bring about his purposes in the world, because nothing is outside of his reach, his power, and his sight. This is the God we serve. And you might say to yourself, well, how does that impact me? I am not an ancient Jew living in Persia. You're absolutely right. But if you're anything like me, you've experienced in your life things that are confusing, things that are overwhelming, disappointments, hurts, things that have been done to you. And the temptation is to believe because those things have happened, and maybe your response to those things has been unfaithful, even sinful. You might think, how could God ever use me? You're missing the point of the book of Esther if you think that. The point of the book of Esther is to tell you, it doesn't matter where you've been or what's been done to you or what you've done. God has a plan that he is bringing to fruition, and you play a part in it. And this week, as I'm wrestling with it, like I'm talking to my wife, Rachel, and I said, okay, I'm really struggling with how do we apply a small section of a story to ourselves? And she gave me a great suggestion, and so I'm passing it on to you, and I want to give her credit for it. She said, what we should do is be looking for other stories in the Bible where God has done similar things, where he uses bad things, difficult things that happen to people, and brings about his good. So this week, if you want to participate in that activity, I have 2 suggestions for you. Here's the first one. You can read this week in Genesis chapter 37 through 45. It tells the story of Joseph. A story that you may be familiar with, and the people who were reading the story of Esther would have been intimately familiar with. And just to give you a little taste of the story, at the end of the story, Joseph says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And that's the story of what Esther is engaged in here. The second thing I would want to encourage you in is to pray this week. You might be able to easily look back on your life and connect the dots of how God's been moving, even through the hardest things you've ever been a part of, even through the most disappointing things that have ever happened to you, even through the things you're most ashamed of. Maybe you can see it, but if you're anything like me, you usually are just moving on to the next thing and not taking any time. This week, I would encourage you to pray and ask God to do something for you, to show you how he's been moving in your story. And when he shows you, rejoice and thank him for his faithfulness. Thank him for his power. Thank him for the way he moves in the world to bring about his good, because his good is our good. Let's pray that God would help us to see it this week. God, we thank you so much for the story of Esther. We confess that it's often hard to figure out what we're supposed to learn from a story like this that feels so far removed from our day-to-day experience, describing things that oftentimes are hard to swallow because they're sinful, distasteful, hard to hear. And yet through it all, we're hearing the story of a God who, although he is stealthy and mysterious, is moving, is orchestrating, is operating in the world in order to save your people. God, I pray that this week we would be a people who spend time quietly with you, listening, asking you to reveal how you've been faithfully moving in our lives and to see what that really looks like. God, we thank you for Jesus. Never has a story better illustrated how the world intends things for evil that you will use for good than in the story of Jesus. We love him. We pray this in his name. Amen.